If you were listening to this right now, uh, you are likely navigating some form of conflict.
Oh, almost certainly.
Right. I mean, you might be managing a massive corporate team or mapping out a long-term business strategy.
Yeah, or trying to outmaneuver a better funded competitor.
Exactly. Or even just, dealing with a hyper-aggressive vendor. And when we are faced with conflict, almost all of us default to the exact same mental image.
A direct collision.
Yes, a direct collision. Two forces just slamming into each other head on. The competitor slashes their prices, so, well, you slash yours.
Right. Someone raises their voice in a meeting, you raise yours.
You throw a punch, they block it, they throw them back. The fundamental assumption is that the biggest, strongest, best resource side is going to win.
Because it's binary. It's physical.
It's a test of brute strength, right?
It is the standard script we are all handed from a very young age, honestly. We are taught that victory requires a direct, overwhelming application of force.
Like if you want to break a wall, you hit it with the biggest hammer you can find. Right. But what if that script isn't just slightly flawed, but entirely fundamentally wrong?
That is the big question.
What if the absolute most guaranteed way to win a fight is to never actually throw a punch at all?
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are tearing up that standard script.
Completely.
Our mission is to explore a concept that might just flip your entire understanding of strategic management, conflict resolution, and competition completely upside down.
We are going to look at how ancient military philosophy and, the brutal, hard-learned lessons of 20th century warfare can be and actively are being directly applied to modern corporate business, cyber warfare, and crisis management.
To do that, we have an incredibly dense, multidisciplinary stack of sources on the table today.
Oh, it's a massive sack.
We are pulling from B.H. Liddell Hart's seminal 1954 book, Strategy, which is arguably one of the most important texts on conflict ever written.
And we are cross-referencing that with excerpts from Sun Tzu's ancient masterpiece, The Art of War. And we aren't just looking at the ancient world either. We're bringing this right up to the modern era.
Right. We have deep analytical breakdowns of the 1968 Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War.
We are diving into philosophical treatises from the ATLA's journal on a really fascinating concept called the hermeneutics of war.
Such a good paper.
It is. And finally, we are pulling from cutting-edge modern intelligence papers published by the IE, which detail the terrifyingly quiet mechanics of hybrid warfare and gray zone cyber attacks.
It is a massive stack, like I said, but there is a singular glowing thread connecting every single one of these documents.
Yes.
It is a concept that Liddell Hart codified as the indirect approach.
The indirect approach. Okay, let's really get into the machinery of this.
Yeah.
Because to truly understand why the indirect approach is so revolutionary, we first have to understand the trauma of the environment that birthed it.
That is crucial context.
Liddell Hart didn't just lock himself in an ivory tower and dream up this theory as like an academic exercise.
No, not at all.
It was forged in the absolute unimaginable horrors of World War I. He was a British Army officer. He served in the trenches.
He was severely gassed and wounded at the Battle of the Somme.
Right. He witnessed firsthand what happens when an entire generation of leadership relies solely on the direct approach.
The direct approach being exactly what it sounds like. Frontal assaults. Massing your troops, waiting for the whistle to blow, and just running hundreds of thousands of young men directly into the teeth of the enemy's heavily fortified, highly prepared machine gun nests.
I think we need to pause on that for a second because modern audiences sometimes lose the scale of what that actually meant.
Yeah.
Why were generals doing this? Were they just foolish?
Not foolish, but theoretically trapped. The prevailing military doctrine of the time across Europe was heavily influenced by a 19th century Prussian military thinker named Karl von Clausewitz.
Okay.
Now, Liddell Hart argued fiercely, and this remains a subject of intense ongoing historical debate, by the way, that the military leaders of the early 20th century had fatally misunderstood and misapplied Clausewitz's writings.
Interesting. How so?
Well, they latched onto this belief that war was entirely about seeking a single, massive, decisive battle to completely and utterly destroy the enemy's armed forces in one fell swoop.
They were obsessed with the knockout blow.
Exactly. They believed that if you just threw enough mass at the enemy's center of gravity, their lines would break. Liddell Hart famously and bitterly derided this as the pursuit of mass and mutual massacre.
Which is a chillingly accurate description of what World War I actually was.
Oh, absolutely.
You had over 8 million soldiers dead in that grueling, attritional trench warfare. You had these generals ordering millions of men over the top, resulting in catastrophic casualties.
Tens of thousands of men dying in a single afternoon.
Just to capture maybe a few hundred yards of shattered mud. It was a bloodbath of unimaginable proportions.
And crucially, from a purely strategic standpoint, it was a complete failure.
Right.
The direct approach, Liddell Hart realized as he watched his friends die in the mud, it doesn't break the enemy. It just hardens their resolve. When you attack someone head-on, you are attacking them exactly where they are expecting you. You are attacking them exactly where their physical defenses are the thickest and exactly where their psychological readiness is at its absolute peak.
You are fighting the enemy on their terms.
Yes, you are fighting the enemy on their terms.
So out of this trauma, Liddell Hart formulates his alternative, the indirect approach.
Right.
The foundational idea here is that instead of seeking out that massive, destructive clash, your ultimate goal is to disrupt the enemy's equilibrium.
Both physically and psychologically.
Yes, physically and psychologically,
Yeah.
before any major engagement even has a chance to happen. He wrote that the true goal of strategy is actually to reduce fighting to the slenderest possible proportions.
And the specific mechanism he proposes to achieve that reduction in fighting is a concept he calls dislocation.
Dislocation.
Yeah. Strategy is entirely about dislocation, and to be successful, it has to operate on two distinct but deeply connected fronts simultaneously.
Okay, let's break that down.
So first, there is physical dislocation.
Let's look at the mechanics of physical dislocation. What does that actually look like on the ground?
It means maneuvering your forces to entirely bypass the enemy's main army or their strongest defenses. You sever their supply lines, you cut off their communication.
You outflank them?
Exactly. You threaten their rear bases, the places where they keep their food, their ammunition, their leadership. You aren't attacking their soldiers directly. You are physically disrupting their logistical ability to function as a cohesive operational unit.
But the sources stress that the second front of dislocation is actually even more critical than the physical one.
Yes. The second front is psychological dislocation. Liddell Hart called this unhinging the balance of mind.
Balance of mind. I like that.
Yeah. So by appearing where the enemy commander absolutely does not expect you, by suddenly threatening their deeply buried supply lines, you induce a sudden, overwhelming panic.
You create this pervasive, paralyzing feeling of being trapped.
Right. The enemy realizes that their meticulously prepared, heavily armed defenses at the front are suddenly entirely useless because the attack isn't coming from the front. The goal is to make them lose the will to fight before a single shot is fired.
Okay, I have to stop you here. I want to push back on this a bit.
Sure.
Because if I'm a business leader or even just someone with a traditional competitive mindset listening to this, I'm thinking, isn't avoiding the enemy's main strength isn't it just running away?
That is the common critique.
Right. If my competitor launches a massive ad campaign and I just ignore it and go do something else, haven't I just surrendered the field? How does deliberately avoiding a fight actually secure a win? It sounds incredibly passive.
It is a highly counterintuitive idea if you are raised on the direct approach, but I assure you it is not passive in the slightest.
Okay.
It is incredibly active, highly calculated, and deeply aggressive. It is simply directed at vulnerabilities rather than strengths. What's fascinating here is I want you to think of this not like two rams locking horns, but like structural engineering.
Structural engineering. Walk me through the physics of that.
Okay, so if you want to bring down a massive fortified stone archway, the direct approach is to stand in front of it and hit the thickest, heaviest stone columns with a sledgehammer until you are exhausted and your hammer is broken.
That is mass and mutual massacre.
Exactly. The indirect approach is finding the single small keystone at the very top or undermining the soft dirt beneath the foundation.
Oh, wow.
You remove the support, and the massive weight of the archway actually does the work of destroying itself. By avoiding the enemy's main strength, you are forcing the opponent to react to your movements. You are making them stretch their forces, pivot their heavy defenses out of position, and scramble to protect their newly exposed flanks.
They exhaust themselves trying to catch you.
Exactly. You are creating paralysis through maneuver. It is like high-level jujitsu. You don't block a heavy strike with your face. You step off the center line. You let their own aggressive momentum pull them off balance, and then you apply pressure to a vulnerable joint.
You haven't matched their strength, you've dislocated their balance.
Precisely.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And the historical texts in our stack are full of incredible examples where this exact maneuver was executed to perfection. Let's look at the Roman general Fabius Maximus during the Second Punic War.
Oh, this is a classic case study.
Yeah. You have Hannibal, one of the greatest military commanders in history, ravaging the Italian peninsula with an unstoppable veteran army. The Romans initially tried the direct approach. They marched massive armies out to meet Hannibal in traditional pitched battles.
And they were slaughtered, utterly decimated at places like Cannae.
Right.
The direct approach almost destroyed the Roman Republic.
So in desperation, the Romans hand dictatorial control to Fabius Maximus. And what does he do? He completely refuses to fight Hannibal.
He enacts the ultimate indirect approach.
He shadows Hannibal's army from a safe distance. He burns the crops in front of them so they can't eat. He harasses their foraging parties. He constantly maneuvers his forces onto high ground where Hannibal's famous heavy cavalry simply cannot deploy.
He was applying the structural engineering analogy. He couldn't smatter the columns of Hannibal's army, so he attacked the foundation. The logistics of starvation.
Yeah.
He dislocated Hannibal physically by denying him supplies, and he dislocated him psychologically by frustrating him and denying him the decisive battle he desperately needed to force a Roman surrender.
Or, to bring it closer to the modern era, let's look at the stark contrast between World War I and World War II and the sources. The difference is staggering.
It really is.
After the bloodbath of WWI, France was terrified of another direct attritional war. So what did they do? They built the Maginot Line.
The Maginot Line was an incredibly massive, technologically advanced, state-of-the-art system of concrete fortifications, obstacles, and weapon installations stretching along their border with Germany.
Right.
It was the physical embodiment of preparing for a direct clash.
But in 1940, the German military utilized a new doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. They looked at the Maginot Line, this impenetrable wall of strength, and they didn't hurl a single division at it. They bypassed it entirely.
They took what Liddell Hart calls the line of least expectation.
They thrust their armored panzer divisions through the Ardennes forest. Now, the French military planners had looked at the Ardennes, this dense, hilly, heavily wooded region, and deemed it completely impassable for heavy armor.
Right. They left it lightly defended. It was their blind spot, and the Germans exploited that blind spot perfectly. It was a massive, indirect flanking maneuver that cut deep into the French rear. They completely severed the Allied lines of communication and logistics.
The French troops sitting inside the impenetrable Maginot Line were suddenly cut off from their command and surrounded from behind.
The result: the nation of France fell in just 6 weeks. The German casualties were around 27,000 dead.
Which obviously is a tragic loss of human life in any context. But when you compare 27,000 dead to the millions upon millions who died in the trenches just 2 decades prior,
Yeah.
I mean, it is a profound, undeniable validation of avoiding the direct approach.
It proved definitively that maneuver, surprise, and dislocation could achieve massive political and military aims far more efficiently and with vastly less bloodshed than the mutual massacre of frontal assaults.
But this brings up a really crucial question. If the indirect approach is so clearly superior, if avoiding the center is so obvious in hindsight, why is it so difficult to execute in real time?
That's the real issue.
Why do leaders, CEOs, and generals constantly default back to these destructive direct clashes?
To understand that, our sources suggest we have to look much deeper. We have to examine the actual philosophy of why we fight in the first place,
Okay.
and how our psychological interpretation of conflict often blinds us to strategic reality.
This is where the sources from the ATLA journal become incredibly important. They provide a brilliant, deep philosophical framework for understanding the roots of conflict.
They really do. They discuss the profound, almost paradoxical intertwining of war and justice. When you trace any conflict back to its absolute origin, whether it's a trade war, a lawsuit, or a physical invasion, almost all of them are ignited by a deeply felt, perceived sense of injustice, or a desperate desire to protect one's current status and rights against a perceived threat.
Right. People don't generally start massive, costly conflicts just for the sake of being evil. They do it because they feel wronged.
Exactly.
They feel the system is rigged, or they feel they are about to be destroyed if they don't act.
Precisely. The motivation is almost always rooted in a narrative of justice. And this leads to a vital concept the sources refer to in Turkish as savaş hermeneutiği, the hermeneutics of war.
Hermeneutics. Let's define that clearly for the audience because it's usually a term reserved for literary or religious scholars, right?
Yes, hermeneutics is traditionally the theory and methodology of text interpretation.
Hmm.
How do we extract the true underlying meaning from a complex text? So, when we apply that to conflict, the hermeneutics of war, we are talking about applying that same deep interpretation and meaning making to the language, the root causes, and crucially, the socio-psychological traumas that drive a conflict.
So instead of just looking at a battlefield map, counting how many tanks the enemy has, and calculating trajectories, you are trying to read the text of human trauma.
Right.
You are looking at the soul of the conflict. You are reading between the lines of the violence to understand the grievance.
Exactly. To truly understand conflict, a strategist must step back and act almost as a philosophical war correspondent. You cannot just be a tactician, you have to be a psychologist.
Yeah.
You have to deeply weigh the socio-psychological state of all the actors involved. You have to understand why they are fighting, what narrative of justice they believe they are serving, and most importantly, what their mental breaking point is.
Because the mental breaking point almost always arrives before the physical breaking point.
This actually connects directly back to Clausewitz, doesn't it? Even though Liddell Hart heavily criticized the military establishment for focusing on Clausewitz's decisive battle concept, Clausewitz himself wrote extensively about what he called the spiritual or moral forces in war.
He absolutely did, and that is often the part of Clausewitz that gets ignored by generals looking for an excuse to attack.
Right.
Clausewitz deeply understood that war is not just a clash of physical matter, steel against steel. It is fundamentally a clash of human wills.
The physical damage inflicted in a conflict, the buildings destroyed, the money lost, often matters far less than the psychological toll it takes on the population and the leadership.
If you can break the enemy's will to fight, their physical capabilities, no matter how vast, become entirely irrelevant.
And there is absolutely no better historical example of this dynamic in our source stack than the 1968 Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War.
Oh man, yeah.
This is the ultimate case study in the hermeneutics of war.
The Tet Offensive is a masterclass in psychological dislocation triumphing over physical defeat. To set the stage, in early 1968, General Giap of North Vietnam launched a massive, highly coordinated, completely surprise attack against over 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam.
They struck simultaneously during the Tet holiday, which was the Vietnamese New Year, a time when a mutual truce had traditionally been observed in previous years.
Now, if you are a traditional military analyst looking strictly at the physical and statistical metrics of that offensive in the weeks that followed, it was a colossal, unmitigated failure for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army.
Completely.
U.S. and South Vietnamese forces recovered from the initial shock and repelled the attacks almost everywhere. The communist forces did not hold any major cities, and the cost was staggering.
Massive, devastating casualties, tens of thousands of experienced fighters wiped out.
Their physical fighting strength in the South was severely depleted for years.
If you were evaluating the war strictly through physical metrics, which the U.S. military leadership, and particularly Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, was famously doing with his obsession over statistical body counts.
Right, the body counts.
You would look at the spreadsheets and conclude that the United States had just won a massive, decisive victory. You killed far more of them than they killed of you. You held the territory. You won.
But psychologically, hermeneutically,
Psychologically, the Tet Offensive was a masterpiece of the indirect approach. It was a fatal blow to the American war effort.
let's walk through the mechanics of why that psychological blow was so devastating. Why did the spreadsheet victory translate into a strategic defeat?
Because it completely, violently shattered the established narrative. Prior to Tet, the American political leadership had been telling the public for months that there was light at the end of the tunnel.
They were citing those exact body count statistics to prove that the enemy was weak, exhausted, and on the verge of total collapse.
The narrative was one of impending, inevitable victory.
And then, suddenly, Americans turn on their televisions, and they see enemy combatants, the same enemy they were told was defeated, breaching the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
They see chaotic street fighting in the capital.
The visual and psychological shock was profound. It proved that the enemy was resilient, highly coordinated, and willing to absorb immense losses to continue the fight indefinitely.
I think this is the perfect moment to translate this into a business context because the exact same dynamic plays out in corporate crises all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Think about a massive legacy corporation facing a scandal or a disruptive new competitor. The legacy company's legal team and financial analysts are acting exactly like Robert McNamara.
Right. They are looking strictly at the physical metrics.
They are sitting in a boardroom saying, look, statistically, our liability here is low. We have a massive cash reserve. The regulatory fines are manageable. Our market share might dip, but our stock price will recover in 3 quarters. We are winning.
They are looking at the body count. They are looking at the spreadsheet.
Yes, but they are entirely missing the spirit of the war. They are ignoring the hermeneutics of the crisis.
That is a brilliant analogy. The spirit of the Vietnam War wasn't lost on the battlefields of Hue or Khe Sanh. It was lost on television screens back in American living rooms.
Right.
When Walter Cronkite, who was widely considered the most trusted man in America at the time, broadcast his personal assessment that the war was mired in a bloody, unwinnable stalemate.
That was it.
That was the moment the psychological will of the American public broke. The physical metrics of how many tanks the U.S. had didn't matter anymore because the political will to use them had evaporated.
For the business leader or strategist listening to this right now,
Yeah.
this is your warning. If you only measure the physical and financial metrics of your business, your quarterly revenue, your unit economics, your supply chain efficiency, and you completely ignore the hermeneutics.
The psychological state of your employees.
Exactly. The morale of your leadership team, the emotional resonance and trust of your brand in the market. If you ignore all that, you will lose the wider war.
That is the core lesson. A disruptive startup might launch a product that, on paper, is financially ruinous for them to produce.
Your analysts look at the competitor's burn rate and tell you, don't worry, they are losing $10 on every unit they sell. They will be bankrupt in 6 months. Ignore them.
But if that new product captures the imagination of the market, if it shifts the psychological baseline of what consumers now expect from that industry, your competitor has achieved a massive psychological dislocation.
They have bypassed your fortified market share and struck directly at the mind of your consumer. By the time they figure out their unit economics, your legacy product is already viewed as obsolete.
Okay, we have established the theoretical and psychological framework. We know we need to avoid the center, attack the flanks, and manage the psychology. But now we need to make this incredibly practical.
Yes, we need to build concrete business plans based on this.
Yeah.
If I'm listening to this, how do I actually optimize my strategy and manage a crisis using the principles of Liddell Hart and Sun Tzu?
We can do that by systematically walking through how to apply Liddell Hart's maxims of strategy and Sun Tzu's foundational factors to a modern business environment.
Let's do it.
Both of these frameworks, despite being separated by thousands of years, are fundamentally about the exact same thing: achieving maximum strategic results with minimum risk and resource expenditure.
Let's start with Sun Tzu's foundation, written back in the 5th century BCE. He explicitly states in The Art of War, all warfare is based on deception.
And he introduces this beautiful, profound philosophy of empty and full, or as it is referred to in the Turkish translations in our sources, doluluk ve boşluk.
The concept of empty and full is the absolute essence of the indirect approach. In any conflict, you must rigorously avoid the enemy's fullness.
Their fullness is their strength. It is their highly prepared defenses, their core competencies, their deeply saturated markets where they have immense brand loyalty. You do not attack there.
Instead, you must strike their emptiness. Their emptiness is their weakness. It is their blind spots, their unguarded flanks, the emerging markets they're ignoring, the customer demographics they are taking for granted.
You are quite literally striking where they are not.
Precisely. Now let's map that onto Liddell Hart's first maxim of strategy. Adjust your end to your means.
In a military context, this means don't plan a campaign that your supply lines can't support.
In business, this is the cardinal rule of not overextending your capital, your talent pool, or your operational capacity. You have to take a cold, hard look at what resources you actually possess and set realistic strategic goals based on that objective reality.
The sources give a stark, tragic military example of failing to adhere to this maxim: the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944.
Right.
By this point, Germany is clearly losing the war. They are being squeezed from both sides. In a desperate attempt to turn the tide, Hitler orders a massive indirect flanking maneuver through the Ardennes forest.
Trying to replicate their success from 1940.
Exactly. The goal was to punch through the weak American lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied forces in half.
It was an audacious plan, and initially the indirect maneuver caused massive psychological dislocation among the surprised American troops.
But there was a fatal flaw.
Germany simply did not have the means. Specifically, they did not have the fuel, the air superiority, or the logistical support to achieve that incredibly ambitious end.
They overextended their supply lines in the freezing winter. Their tanks literally ran out of gas.
The offensive collapsed, resulting in 120,000 devastating casualties they could not replace.
The sources also point to a more modern geopolitical example of failing to adjust ends to means: the post-invasion reconstruction of Iraq.
Oh, yes.
The U.S. military absolutely had the means to win the initial conventional war against the Iraqi army. They achieved that end quickly.
But the strategic failure occurred because the U.S. failed to match its means to the wildly ambitious subsequent end of rebuilding the entire nation's infrastructure, imposing a new political system, and managing a massive counterinsurgency all from scratch in an unfamiliar cultural terrain.
The means were insufficient for the desired end.
Translating this to a corporate setting, ignoring this maxim, is painfully common.
Oh, it happens all the time.
It looks like a mid-sized tech company, flush with a recent round of funding, deciding they're going to simultaneously launch a massive new flagship software platform, expand operations into 3 entirely new international markets, and attempt a hostile acquisition of a competitor, all while operating on an 18-month cash runway.
They are trying to capture Antwerp without enough fuel.
Exactly. They've not adjusted their ends to their means. They will inevitably overextend their logistics.
Meaning their cash burn will accelerate, their top engineering talent will burn out from context switching, and their customer service will degrade.
They become incredibly vulnerable to a catastrophic collapse the moment a stronger, more focused competitor pushes back, or the macroeconomic weather changes.
Here is where the strategic advice gets really interesting for your career, though. Let's look at Liddell Hart's 3rd and 4th maxims, which should be combined. Choose the line of least expectation and exploit the line of least resistance.
This is where we transition from defensive self-assessment to offensive maneuvering.
Right.
In a business context, what is a frontal assault? A frontal assault is a direct price war. If you and your biggest competitor offer nearly identical products, and you decide to compete by just continuously slashing your prices to steal the same pool of customers, you are in a trench war.
You are engaging in mass and mutual financial massacre.
I want to push back on this, though, because I hear this from executives all the time. If my competitor drops their price by 20%, my customers are going to walk across the street. If I don't respond directly by matching their price, I lose market share today. My board of directors is going to fire me before I have time to find this magical empty space. How is refusing to engage in a price war not just corporate suicide in the short term?
It is a terrifying position to be in, I admit, but responding directly validates the competitor's framing of the market. If you drop your price, you are admitting that price is the only differentiator.
Wow. Yeah.
Margins drop to zero, R&D budgets are slashed, and both companies suffer long-term damage. You exploit the line of least resistance by changing the terrain of the battle entirely.
How do you do that practically?
You find the empty spaces. Instead of fighting over the existing bloody pie, you use innovative product launches or entirely new business models to tap into uncontested markets.
Think of the concept of blue ocean strategy, which is essentially the modern corporate translation of the indirect approach.
Exactly. If your competitor slashes prices on individual software licenses, you don't match the price. You shift to a subscription model that bundles services they don't offer.
You bypass their fortified product lines and attack an audience or a specific customer need that isn't currently being served. You make their price cut irrelevant.
You move where the enemy isn't, and that leads perfectly into Maxim 5. Take a line of operation which offers alternative objectives.
I absolutely love this one. The goal is to put your competitor on the horns of a dilemma.
It is arguably the most beautiful and sophisticated strategic concept Liddell Hart offers. You design your business maneuver, your product launch, your marketing campaign, your expansion, so that it genuinely threatens multiple areas of your competitor's business simultaneously.
The key is that they cannot defend both.
Right. If they move their resources to defend market A, you easily sweep in and take market B. If they scramble to defend market B, you take market A.
They're paralyzed by indecision because any move they make is the wrong move.
Our sources from Grokopedia explicitly link this concept to corporate mergers and acquisitions. Rather than engaging in massive, exhaustive legal, marketing, and pricing battles to crush a rival directly in your core market, a savvy corporation will use flexible alliances or strategic acquisitions to create a dilemma.
Let's map that out. Say you acquire a smaller company that operates in an adjacent industry. Suddenly, that acquisition gives you a foothold in your rival's critical supply chain, and it gives you direct access to a new, younger demographic they have been struggling to reach.
You have created alternative objectives. Your rival is now panicking.
Do they aggressively try to secure their supply chain, which costs capital? Or do they launch a massive marketing blitz to win back the younger demographic?
They don't know which threat is your primary objective, and by the time they figure it out, you have already exploited their overcommitment in the other direction.
The sources note that this concept is also incredibly prevalent and visible in sports. They mention hypermodern chess openings, specifically the Nimzo-Indian defense.
Walk me through the mechanics of that, because it perfectly illustrates the indirect approach.
In classical chess strategy, the direct approach is to aggressively move your pawns to occupy the four center squares of the board as quickly as possible. You build a fortified wall in the middle.
Right.
The hypermodern school of chess, like the Nimzo-Indian, completely subverts this. Instead of fighting pawn for pawn in the center mass and mutual massacre, you allow your opponent to push their pawns forward.
You essentially hand them the center.
You appear to hand them the center,
Yeah.
but in reality, you are controlling those center squares indirectly from the flanks, using the long-range power of your bishops and the tricky movements of your knights.
By letting the opponent push their pawns too far forward, you encourage them to overextend. They create structural weaknesses behind their pawns.
Their fullness in the center becomes brittle. And once they are overextended, you strike the newly created emptiness in their structure, collapsing their center entirely.
The sources also use the analogy of Pep Guardiola's soccer tactics. Juego de posición, positional play.
It's exactly. Guardiola is arguably the greatest modern practitioner of the indirect approach in sports. His teams don't just kick the ball straight up the middle of the field into the teeth of the opponent's strongest central defenders.
They use rapid passing triangles and incredibly strict spatial management to indirectly overload certain zones of the pitch, usually the flanks or what they call the half spaces.
How does overloading a zone physically drag the defense?
If Guardiola puts 4 of his best attacking players on the far left side of the field, the defending team's natural instinct, their direct approach, is to shift their defensive line heavily to the left to neutralize the threat.
They have to, or they'll be overrun.
But the moment the defense shifts to cover the overload, they stretch their physical formation. They leave a massive, gaping, empty space on the opposite right flank.
Guardiola's team then executes one rapid sweeping cross-field pass into that empty space, where a winger is waiting completely unmarked. They exhaust the opponent's equilibrium through maneuver.
It is brilliant. Now, we also have to mention Liddell Hart's negative maxims, the things you must never do under any circumstances.
Number 1, do not attack prepared defenses. If your competitor has a 90% market share and a billion-dollar marketing budget in a specific vertical, do not launch a copycat product directly at them.
And number 2, do not repeat a failed attack along the same line.
If a massive marketing campaign fails to generate leads or a new product launch bombs spectacularly, do not let your ego dictate your strategy.
Do not just pour more money into the exact same strategy, hoping that pushing harder will yield a different result. That is the literal definition of attritional warfare. You must pivot and find a new line of approach.
Which brings us perfectly into crisis optimization. How do we make decisions when the pressure is on?
The sources highlight a fascinating historical parallel. How Japanese businesses rapidly transformed their nation from a relatively isolated feudal society into a modern global economic powerhouse in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
They achieved this, in large part, by deeply internalizing Sun Tzu's doctrine of winning without fighting into their corporate culture.
They understood that in a crisis, panic leads to frontal assaults. To prevent panic, decision-making must be systematically routed through a filter.
Sun Tzu provides that filter with his 5 foundational factors. If an organization evaluates a crisis through these 5 lenses, they almost naturally find the path of least resistance.
Let's run a diagnostic using these 5 factors for a modern business leader currently facing a crisis. Factor number 1 is moral law, or harmony.
In a modern corporate context, moral law translates directly to your company culture, your mission, and your internal alignment.
When a crisis hits, you have to ask, do your employees genuinely believe in the leadership? Is the organization capable of moving as a single cohesive unit, or are different departments fracturing and blaming each other?
If you lack internal harmony, you cannot possibly execute the complex, coordinated maneuvers required by the indirect approach. Your strategy will fall apart from the inside.
Factor number 2 is weather.
In business, the weather is the macroeconomic climate. Are interest rates rapidly rising? Is there a global recession looming? Are supply chains snarled due to a pandemic?
You cannot fight the weather. A direct approach tries to stubbornly push a product launch despite a market crash. The indirect approach mandates that you adapt your strategy to the weather, perhaps pivoting from aggressive expansion to cash conservation and internal optimization until the storm passes.
Factor number 3 is terrain.
Terrain is the specific landscape you are fighting on. It is the regulatory environment, the competitive market structure, the digital platforms you rely on.
If you are a tech startup, Apple's App Store policies are your terrain. If you're fighting an uphill battle against severe new government regulations, you are fighting on bad terrain. You must meticulously map the terrain before launching any new initiative.
Factor number 4 is leadership.
This refers to the intelligence, the credibility, the empathy, and crucially, the courage of your executive team.
A true leader must possess the intellectual flexibility to abandon a failing direct strategy and the courage to embrace the uncertainty of an indirect maneuver, even when the board of directors is screaming for immediate, visible action.
And finally, factor number 5 is discipline.
Discipline is the operational efficiency and rigor of your organization. It's great to have a brilliant indirect strategy, but can your supply chain actually handle the rapid pivot you are demanding?
Do you have the organizational discipline to execute a complex strategic shift without descending into total chaos?
If a business leader evaluates their crisis through those 5 factors, harmony, weather, terrain, leadership, discipline, they force themselves to step back from the emotional desire to strike back.
They avoid the panic of a frontal assault. Now, we have talked extensively about trenches, we've talked about historical battles, and we've talked about corporate boardrooms. But there is a domain we absolutely must discuss.
It is a domain where the indirect approach isn't just an option, it is essentially the only option. We are moving from corporate strategy to the digital battlefield. Cyber warfare.
Cyber warfare is the purest, most terrifyingly perfect modern incarnation of Liddell Hart and Sun Tzu's philosophies. It is the ultimate manifestation of the indirect approach.
We hear about cyber attacks constantly in the news, but I want to look at the underlying mechanics. What does the rise of cyber warfare mean for the future of geopolitical conflict?
It means that the era of massive, kinetic, direct force engagements between major global powers, the kind of wars we saw in the 20th century, may be heavily curtailed, simply because the cost of a direct clash is now unimaginably high.
If 2 nuclear-armed nations engage directly on a battlefield, the risk of escalation to a civilization-ending nuclear exchange is omnipresent.
The direct engagement is far too escalatory. It violates Liddell Hart's rule against mass and mutual massacre on a planetary scale.
So because they cannot safely send bomber planes and tank divisions across a border, they send malicious code across fiber optic cables.
They use the internet to bypass fortified physical borders entirely.
Precisely. Cyber attacks do not confront an enemy's armed forces. They bypass the military front lines completely and target what Liddell Hart called the balance of strength.
The logistical, economic, infrastructural, and informational backbone of a nation.
By quietly crippling a power grid in the middle of winter, shutting down a national financial system, or shutting off a major oil pipeline, you cause profound, devastating moral dislocation.
You create mass panic and paralysis within the civilian population and the political leadership without ever having to drop a single bomb or fire a single shot.
The sources outline a few chillingly perfect, real-world examples of this. Let's look at the mechanics of Stuxnet in 2010.
This is widely considered the first true cyber weapon, attributed generally to the intelligence agencies of the United States and Israel acting against Iran's nuclear enrichment program.
Now, the direct approach to stopping Iran's nuclear program would have been launching a massive kinetic airstrike to physically bomb the fortified nuclear facilities at Natanz.
But consider the consequences of that direct approach. An airstrike would have been highly escalatory. It would have likely triggered a regional war, massive retaliation against Allied assets, and severe, unpredictable geopolitical fallout.
Furthermore, the physical defenses around those facilities, anti-aircraft batteries, deep underground bunkers, were heavily prepared. A direct attack explicitly violates Liddell Hart's negative maxim: do not attack prepared defenses.
So they had to take the line of least expectation. They found the empty space. They used a highly sophisticated software vulnerability, a malicious computer worm.
But what makes Stuxnet a masterpiece of the indirect approach isn't just how it got in, but what it did once it was inside. It didn't just turn the screens red and blow things up.
No, it was far more elegant and insidious than that. Once the worm crossed the air gap and got onto the isolated, highly secure SCADA control systems inside the Natanz facility, it subtly and quietly altered the rotational speeds of the uranium enrichment
It
centrifuges,
made them spin slightly too fast and then slightly too slow.
creating structural fatigue.
Exactly. It caused the delicate centrifuges to literally tear themselves apart from the inside over a period of months. But the true genius of the deception, the real Sun Tzu element, was that while the centrifuges were destroying themselves, the Stuxnet code was simultaneously sending false pre-recorded data to the Iranian engineers' monitoring screens.
Telling them everything was operating perfectly normally.
The engineers had no idea they were under attack until the machines were already broken. It is the absolute epitome of psychological deception and physical dislocation.
It severely delayed the Iranian nuclear program by years. It achieved the strategic objective, and it did so completely indirectly, leaving the Iranians confused and chasing ghosts in their own machinery.
Another massive example from our intelligence sources is the SolarWinds hack that came to light in 2020. This perfectly illustrates the concept of a supply chain attack.
Let's say you are a state-sponsored hacker, and you want to infiltrate the U.S. Treasury, the Department of Homeland Security, and a dozen Fortune 500 companies. A direct, brute force attack on their fortified perimeter servers is incredibly difficult and noisy.
They have massive digital walls, armies of cybersecurity analysts, and sophisticated intrusion detection systems.
Their fullness is their perimeter defense. So you don't attack the perimeter, you find the emptiness.
The adversaries realized that almost all of these highly secure organizations relied on the exact same trusted third-party network management software, a program called Orion, created by a company named SolarWinds.
Instead of attacking the hardened targets directly, the hackers went upstream. They compromised the SolarWinds software development servers, a much softer target.
And they poisoned the well. They attached their malicious code, a backdoor, into a routine, seemingly harmless software update.
Exactly. And because SolarWinds was a trusted vendor, when thousands of highly secure organizations downloaded this routine update, their own automated security systems waved the malicious code right through the front door.
They unknowingly invited the enemy inside their digital fortresses. It is the ultimate flanking maneuver in cyberspace.
The hackers bypassed the billion-dollar perimeter defenses entirely and achieved widespread, deep infiltration indirectly by weaponizing trust.
The sources also detail the long game played by Chinese cyber espionage groups, specifically detailing the operations of PLA Unit 61398.
This is a fascinating long-term application of Liddell Hart's first maxim, adjusting ends to means. For decades, the Chinese military establishment recognized a fundamental reality.
They could not, in the short term, match the conventional direct military strength, the global power projection, or the massive R&D budgets of the United States. A direct military confrontation would be suicidal.
So rather than trying to build a bigger hammer, they adopted a strategy of limited, indirect aims. Our sources detail how Unit 61398 and similar state-sponsored groups engaged in massive, sustained, and incredibly quiet campaigns of cyber espionage.
Their goal wasn't to destroy infrastructure. Their goal was to steal intellectual property, classified military designs, aerospace schematics, and cutting-edge technological secrets from Western defense contractors and corporations.
They aren't trying to destroy the U.S. military today in a decisive battle. They're utilizing the indirect approach to slowly, systematically erode their adversaries' technological advantages asymmetrically over a period of decades.
It is strategic death by 1,000 digital cuts.
It is the indirect approach applied across a generational timeline. Think about the return on investment on that strategy. You acquire the incredibly complex technology required to build a fifth-generation fighter jet or advanced microchips, but you completely bypass the decades of trial, error, and billions of dollars in research and development that your adversary had to spend.
You balance the scales of global power without ever firing a kinetic shot.
And as we move beyond just code, servers, and espionage, we enter an even murkier, more complex arena. Beyond cyber, we enter the realm of what the IE papers term hybrid warfare.
This is where the defined lines between peace and conflict, between civilian and military, between truth and fiction, become completely intentionally blurred.
Hybrid warfare is essentially the synchronized full-spectrum application of every indirect tool available. It integrates conventional military posturing with political subversion, cyber operations, severe economic pressure, and massive coordinated disinformation campaigns.
Now, before we dive into the specific geographical and historical examples of hybrid warfare that our sources provide, it is important to frame our approach. We're going to be discussing the strategic actions of Russia, the strategies of China, and deeply sensitive ongoing events in Taiwan, Crimea, and the South China Sea.
Right. Our goal today is not to litigate the global politics of these regions, nor to take a moral or political side on the geopolitical stage. We are strictly opening up the strategic playbook. We are neutrally analyzing the mechanics of how these state actors are applying the theories of indirect maneuver to achieve their geopolitical goals, exactly as documented in our intelligence sources.
With that analytical lens in place, the prime textbook example of Russian hybrid warfare detailed in the sources is their deeply ingrained doctrine of maskirovka.
Maskirovka translates roughly to camouflage or concealment in English, but the sources stress that it is much, much more than just tactical battlefield trickery like putting a camouflage net over a tank or painting a ship gray.
It is strategic psychological deception that operates at the highest levels of geopolitics.
It is essentially geopolitical gaslighting on a national scale. Maskirovka incorporates covert military maneuvers, the strict maintenance of plausible deniability, and massive, overwhelming disinformation campaigns designed to shape the enemy's perception of reality on multiple levels simultaneously.
The ultimate goal is to keep the adversary, whether that is a neighboring country or the entirety of NATO, so entirely confused and paralyzed debating what your true intentions actually are, that by the time they figure it out, it is already too late for them to react effectively.
The annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 is highlighted as the absolute masterclass of Maskirovka in action. Let's look at the mechanics of how they achieve that without triggering World War III. The sources detail the sudden appearance of what the media dubbed the Little Green Men.
The Little Green Men were heavily armed, highly professional, elite special forces troops. They were wearing standard issue, modern combat gear, but their green uniforms completely lacked any national insignias, flags, or identifying unit markers.
They suddenly and quietly appeared across Crimea, systematically seizing key infrastructure, government buildings, communication hubs, and military bases.
But because they technically had no insignias, the Russian government could, and absolutely did, look the international community in the eye and initially deny that these were regular Russian military forces.
They spun a narrative that these were simply spontaneous local self-defense militias composed of concerned citizens who had bought gear at surplus stores.
This is the absolute crux of the indirect approach in hybrid warfare. Everyone in the intelligence community knew they were Russian Spetsnaz troops. The plausible deniability was incredibly thin.
It didn't matter that it was thin, it only mattered that it existed. By maintaining that sliver of deniability, Russia created an impenetrable fog of legal and political confusion.
They shaped the international media narrative into a debate about the identity of the troops, rather than the action of the invasion.
They completely paralyzed the decision-making loops of Western governments. While diplomats at the UN and NATO leaders were holding endless meetings, arguing over the precise legal definition of an invasion, debating whether these troops constituted an ephemeral act of war, and worrying about whether a military response would be seen as an unprovoked escalation.
Russia was establishing total, irreversible physical and territorial control on the ground.
They achieved their massive political objective, the annexation of a highly strategic peninsula, without triggering an open kinetic war with Ukraine or its powerful Western allies at that specific time. It was a masterstroke of fusing psychological confusion with physical dislocation.
Parallel to the Russian doctrine, our sources from the IE paper outline the Chinese military concept of unrestricted warfare.
This doctrine formally integrates traditional kinetic force with electronic warfare, psychological operations, economic coercion, and military deception.
The stated goal, which is remarkably similar to Liddell Hart's theories from 70 years ago, is to entirely usurp and paralyze the adversary's automated and political decision-making processes while fiercely protecting your own.
We see the mechanics of this playing out vividly in the South China Sea with China's execution of a gray zone strategy. Gray zone tactics intentionally occur in that highly ambiguous, murky space between routine, peaceful statecraft and open armed warfare.
They are aggressive actions that stay just below the threshold that would legally or politically justify a conventional military response from an adversary.
Let's look at the island building. Over the past decade, China has been utilizing massive fleets of dredging ships to pull sand from the ocean floor and build massive artificial islands on top of disputed coral reefs in international or contested waters.
And crucially, they initially framed this massive engineering project under the guise of entirely civilian, peaceful purposes. They claim these islands are being built for scientific research, environmental monitoring, or to provide navigation aids for international shipping.
It is presented as a benign activity.
But the reality over time proves to be very different.
Exactly. Slowly, incrementally over years, these scientific outposts are heavily militarized. They build 3-kilometer-long runways capable of handling heavy bombers. They install advanced radar facilities, deep water ports for naval vessels, and sophisticated anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile systems.
These artificial islands become highly lethal, forward-operating military outposts that allow China to project massive power deep into the Pacific and enforce what military strategists call an anti-accessoria denial bubble.
And here is the genius of the indirect approach. If a rival nation, say the United States or the Philippines, wants to stop this expansion, what do they actually do? If a U.S. Navy destroyer fires a missile to blow up a dredging ship that is ostensibly just building a weather station for scientific research, the United States is instantly painted as the aggressor.
They are the ones that escalate into open, kinetic war.
China has perfectly placed its adversaries on the horns of a dilemma. Do you do nothing and watch the geopolitical map literally be rewritten in front of you? Or do you take direct military action and risk sparking a major war over a pile of dredged sand?
They are slowly, incrementally shifting the geopolitical reality on the ground, changing the terrain itself, without ever providing a clear, unambiguous justification for an armed response. They are securing massive territorial claims without firing a shot.
We see a similar, though primarily psychological and informational, application of the indirect approach regarding the situation in Taiwan. The sources highlight massive, systematic, daily disinformation campaigns emanating from the mainland, specifically designed to erode the democratic legitimacy of the Taiwanese government.
It is important to note that while a direct, amphibious invasion of Taiwan is always a looming threat, it would be the ultimate direct approach. An amphibious assault is historically the most difficult, destructive, and economically costly military operation possible.
The preferred indirect strategy is entirely different.
The strategy is psychological attrition.
Yes, the strategy is to utilize the digital domain to project a constant, overwhelming idea to both the domestic Taiwanese population and the broader international community that Taiwan is a chaotic, ungovernable, and inevitably failing state.
By constantly amplifying internal political divisions on social media, spreading sophisticated fake news about the economy or pandemic responses, and conducting massive, highly visible, intimidating military exercises just miles outside territorial waters, the goal is to induce a state of permanent moral dislocation.
The goal isn't necessarily to conquer the island by force tomorrow. The goal is to make the population feel so deeply exhausted, so geopolitically isolated, and so psychologically overwhelmed by the constant looming pressure that a critical mass of the population eventually just gives up.
They eventually accept political reunification as a preferable, peaceful alternative to the endless anxiety of a potential war. It is attempting to secure the ultimate strategic victory entirely through the exhaustion of the enemy's psychological will.
Which brings us to a very pressing, very urgent question. If the modern world is fundamentally defined by this constant low-level indirect worsening, if we are surrounded by cyber attacks, supply chain manipulations, disinformation, and gray zone tactics, how do we possibly defend against it?
How do you protect an organization, a nation, or a business against an enemy that absolutely refuses to fight you directly?
This is the crucial pivot for our listeners. We need actionable solutions. The IE paper in our source stack specifically addresses this. It outlines a concrete theoretical plan for large organizations, whether that is the European Union trying to protect its elections, NATO trying to protect its borders, or a multinational corporation trying to protect its intellectual property to build strategic defense and resilience against hybrid warfare.
The absolute foundation of defending against the indirect approach is achieving a state of radical, unbroken awareness. Because the indirect approach fundamentally relies on surprise, deception, and exploiting the fog of information, your defensive posture must be explicitly structured to pierce that fog instantly.
The IE paper emphasizes the absolute non-negotiable necessity of what they call harmonized alert systems.
Let's break down what harmonized intelligence actually means. In a military or geopolitical context, the sources say this means meticulously fusing different, highly disparate types of intelligence streams. You cannot just rely on one source of truth.
You have to fuse SISD signals intelligence, which is intercepted radio communications or encrypted data, with IMINT, imagery intelligence from high-resolution satellites, and OSINT, open source intelligence, which is analyzing public social media posts, local news reports, and shipping data.
To illustrate how vital this is, let's look back at the Crimea example. In 2014, the intelligence was siloed. But imagine if Western intelligence agencies had perfectly and instantly fused their data.
Imagine if they had combined the IMAN satellite imagery showing Russian troop transports massing near the border with the SIGINT-intercepted radio chatter indicating deployment orders, and the OSINT's local Crimeans posting smartphone videos of unmarked soldiers speaking with distinct Russian accents.
If those streams were fused instantly, the fog of plausible deniability would have been dispelled in hours, not weeks. It would have potentially allowed for a rapid, coordinated diplomatic or economic response before the territory was fully irreversibly secured.
Now, let's translate this critical concept to the business leader listening right now. What does fusing intelligence mean for a CEO, a founder, or a strategic manager? It means you have to aggressively, ruthlessly break down your corporate silos.
Absolutely. Corporate silos are the greatest structural vulnerability any company has against an indirect attack. Imagine your company is currently facing a highly coordinated hybrid threat from a ruthless, well-funded competitor.
But they aren't attacking you head-on. Instead, they are simultaneously trying to aggressively poach your top 3 software engineers with massive salary offers. They are secretly funding a stealth PR campaign to discredit the safety of your new product on industry subreddits, and they are quietly undercutting your prices by 30% in a secondary emerging market that you thought was safe.
This happens every day in the corporate world. And here is the danger. If your HR department is only looking at their siloed metrics, employee retention, and salary bands, they just think you have a localized compensation issue.
If your marketing team is only monitoring their specific silo brand sentiment and ad click-through rates, they just think you are having a bad PR cycle. And if your sales team is only looking at their regional revenue targets, they just think they lost a few accounts to a localized pricing dispute. No one sees the big picture.
Because the intelligence isn't harmonized, you are actively being dislocated, and your organization cannot process the threat cohesively. HR treats the symptom, marketing treats the symptom, sales treats the symptom, but the disease is killing you.
You need a unified intelligence dashboard.
Yes, you need the heads of HR, marketing, sales, and IT communicating constantly, sharing anomalies, and fusing their data so the executive team can realize, wait a minute, we are losing engineers, our brand is taking a hit online, and our secondary market is collapsing all at the exact same time.
This isn't 3 separate, isolated operational problems. This is a highly coordinated, indirect attack by our competitor designed to bleed us dry.
Only by harmonizing your internal intelligence can you mount a cohesive defense. Sun Tzu famously wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles."
The ultimate foolproof defense against deception is rigorous self-knowledge and a rapid, flexible response capability. If you identify the indirect maneuver early, if you see them trying to turn your flank, you can brace your organization, shift your resources to cover your emptiness, and refuse to be psychologically unbalanced.
By doing so, you force the competitor into a terrible choice. They must either completely abandon their expensive indirect maneuver, or they must commit to a direct frontal fight against a defense that is now fully aware and prepared for them. You turn the tables.
Wow. We have covered an immense, truly staggering amount of ground today. Let's recap this journey. We started our deep dive in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of World War I, where the absolute folly of the direct approach, the tragic pursuit of mass and mutual massacre was laid bare for history to judge.
We saw how that trauma led B.H. Liddell Hart to codify the indirect approach, arguing that the true highest goal of strategy is not destruction, but physical and psychological dislocation. You do not smash your head against the enemy's fortified strength. You flow like water to strike their emptiness. You always take the line of least expectation.
We brought in the philosophy of the ATLA's journal and the hermeneutics of war, understanding that conflict is never just about math. It is as much about the spirit, the morale, and the deeply held narratives of justice as it is about physical force.
The Tet Offensive proved unequivocally that you can technically lose every single physical battle, but still utterly win the war if you successfully break the enemy's psychological will to fight.
We took those ancient texts and historical maxims and applied them directly to the modern boardroom. We looked at how systematically adjusting your ends to your means, creatively seeking alternative objectives to paralyze rivals, and maintaining internal harmony are the ultimate keys to outmaneuvering competitors in business.
allowing you to secure massive market share without ever engaging in suicidal, margin-destroying price wars.
And finally, we plunged into the terrifyingly quiet digital and geopolitical gray zones of the 21st century. The subtle physical destruction of Stuxnet, the weaponized trust of the SolarWinds supply chain hack, the gaslighting maskirovka of the little green men in Crimea, and the artificial islands in the South China Sea.
All of these prove that today, the longest way round truly is the shortest way home. Winning without fighting isn't just some poetic, ancient philosophical ideal. It is the absolute highest form of modern success.
It is the defining, inescapable characteristic of modern conflict across every domain.
It really is.
To everyone listening, thank you for coming on this deep dive with us today. Thank you for taking the time to engage with these heavy, complex historical frameworks, and for thinking deeply about how these mechanisms apply directly to your own modern challenges, your career, your business strategy, and how you manage conflict in your own life.
It requires a fundamental, sometimes uncomfortable shift in perspective. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the absolute totality of everything we have discussed today.
Go for it.
If modern competition, whether we are talking about high-stakes global geopolitics, massive multinational corporate business, or the unseen battles happening in cyberspace right now, has entirely adopted the indirect approach through the use of proxies, supply chain manipulations, economic coercion, and constant daily information warfare.
Okay.
Are we ever truly living in a state of peace? Or are we just quietly existing in a continuous, unacknowledged state of permanent indirect maneuver?
That is a haunting thought. It really makes you wonder. If you never actually throw a punch, but you never stop circling, feinting, and exhausting your opponent, does the fight ever really end? Keep thinking about it. We will see you next time on The Deep Dive.